What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you with our Dynasty wide receiver rankings. You guys showed a lot of support on the running back rankings. We figured we'd come at you with the Dynasty wide receivers. This one has a lot of variance. There's a lot of tier breaks and discussions that we need to be talking about with these players. We all know this is a very deep position in fantasy football. Danny, how are you doing today?
Doing well. And yeah, you prefaced it, Corey. We've kind of talked about this a little bit with the running backs, but it's especially true for the wide receiver position. Because let's be honest, the running back position as a whole is typically a more win now centric type position because they don't have the longevity. However, these receivers, you could be talking about guys that can either be on your team for 13, 14 years if your leagues end up lasting that long, or you could be talking about guys that, oh yeah, they're going to win you a championship within the next 3 years. We're going to be talking about that whole kind of package today and really how youth versus win now type mentality kind of balances itself out. And in general, to not draft, as I said with the running backs, strictly off the position of these rankings, but more so in those tiers to really formulate your plan. If you want to go young or if you want to go win now, you can kind of balance out the facts of going with a guy that maybe we have at 12 versus a guy that maybe we have at 11 simply due to the age versus the overall 2021 output. So excited to go through, excited to crack our knuckles on this.
If you haven't already done so, I encourage you guys to like this video, comment any of your thoughts down below. We noticed we've gotten a lot of new subscribers recently. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, turn the bell notifications on as well. We're going to hit the intro, and then we're going to get right into these. All right, so on the screen right now, you guys will see our consensus top, 20 wide receivers or so. We condensed this into the top 12 that we're going to, focus on for this video. And then we're going to kind of go rapid fire at the end, honorable mentions, closing out our top 20. So this is technically our top 20 receiver rankings, but we're going to just focus on the top 12 to begin with. We're going to start with wide receiver one, my wide receiver one, your wide receiver one. Yeah. I'll let you get into Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, I mean, this is just easy in my opinion at this point, especially with the news of Davante Adams with Aaron Rodgers. We'll get into that a little bit later, but Tyreek Hill is the most feared player in fantasy football. I mean, this is a guy who's coming off a 15 touchdown, 1,400-yard season, who's going to be tethered to the right arm of the NFL's best quarterback for the foreseeable future. I mean, we're talking about in the quarterbacks video, Patrick Mahomes is one of the only true assets in the NFL we can see playing for 10 years. Well, Tyreek Hill is going to be catching passes from him as soon as, for the rest of his career, to be quite honest. But the only reason this guy could even bust in the season would be due to injury. And even when he got hurt 2 years ago, he was still extremely productive. Like when this guy is on the field, he is a near lock for 1,200 plus yards, double-digit touchdowns. And his upside in any given season for touchdowns, given the fact that, we just saw Mahomes throw for 50 3 years ago, is just elite. So overall, I mean, when you're looking at this guy, it's really quite easy to understand why he would be our consensus one. He was the wide receiver 2 this past season on those incredible efficiencies, wide receiver 1 in 2018. And in general, you can't really talk about any other receiver being as locked and loaded in their offense as Tyreek Hill will be with those Kansas City Chiefs. So I think it's a no-brainer at 1. And to be honest, he kind of fits both mindsets. Although he's 27, so I guess it's quote-unquote a little on the older side, he's still young enough to the point where if you want to reload and you want to contend year 2, year 3, he's still going to be able to produce by then. So with that being said, I think Tyreek Hill is a clear-cut 101 at this current point.
Right. And there's no receiver, again, outside of Davante Adams, who we'll get into as long as he has Aaron Rodgers, that I can comfortably project for 12-plus touchdowns every single season because we have absolutely no concerns about his offense. We have absolutely no concerns about his quarterback, and we have absolutely no concerns about his role within his offense. We know that he is the guy that makes that offense go, right? Travis Kelce is the guy that gets all the, targets and the yards and stuff, but Travis Kelce is only as good as Travis Kelce is because he has Tyreek to stretch out the defense, and those guys work in tandem. They're both great players in their own right, but they help each other out constantly. Like they completely complement what one another does. And I mean, Travis Kelce's the consensus tight end 1 for most people. Tyreek Hill to me it should be the consensus wide receiver 1 for most people. Tyreek Hill to me is stone cold lock. There's no receiver I would pick over this guy just because of that 3 to 4 year window. We always talk about 10 years in Dynasty and 15 years and stuff, but let's be honest, at wide receiver, you can only comfortably project probably 3 to 4 years. And at running back, it's probably only 2 to 3 years that you can comfortably project. So for the next 3 to 4 years, there's absolutely no receiver I'd rather have than Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, no, fully agree. Tyreek Hill is a bona fide stud. So with that being said, let's get on to another stud and one that was a big winner this offseason. Take it away with A.J. Brown.
Yeah, and A.J. Brown is a guy that we've always had doubts about, especially from a volume perspective, right? Let me just read off some names last year that had more targets than A.J. Brown. Russell Gage, Cole Beasley, Evan Ingram, Tyler Boyd, Logan Thomas, J.D. McKissick, and Jerry Jeudy. These are all players that received more than the 106 targets that A.J. Brown received. Despite the 106 targets that he received, we saw him go for 70 catches, 1,075 yards, and 11 touchdowns. And if you pace out his production from week 5 on, when he was the wide receiver 5 in points per game during that span and the wide receiver 3 overall, he was on pace for 120 targets, 80 receptions, 1,275 yards, and 14 touchdowns. There was only one game last year where A.J. Brown received more than 10 targets, which is absurd. To me, every game, if you go back and look at his game logs, he has between 6 and 9 targets consistently every game. And the game that he received 10 targets was week 17. So it wasn't even a game that people were playing in fantasy. And he went 10 for 151 and a touchdown in that game against the Texans. So the moral of the story of this whole A.J. Brown thing is this dude is going to get more targets next year. Corey Davis, Jonnu Smith, Adam Humphries, Khalif Raymond, all these guys are gone, vacating over 200 targets, 2,000 receiving yards in the offense. And yeah, I like Des Fitzpatrick as a sleeper because of that vacated production as well. But A.J. Brown will receive a bump in production. He was on pace for 120 targets, like I said, last year. You could definitely see that number move from 120, which is more, back-end wide receiver 1 range with A.J. Brown's type of efficiency, to that 140, 160 target range that we see from guys like Stefon Diggs this year, like we see from Davante Adams and we see from DeAndre Hopkins, like those type of bona fide alpha wide receiver ones. We know he has a great quarterback who trusts him, who will throw the ball to him in the red zone because of those 11 touchdowns that he had last year. And again, with Jonnu Smith leaving, that was 8 red zone touchdowns that Jonnu Smith had last year. So I think the involvement that A.J. Brown is going to see from the most important areas of the field is really what propels him to that wide receiver 2 status for me. And, of course, the elite efficiency and talent that he's already shown thus far in his career.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about A.J. Brown and what makes him so unique is that you're talking about a receiver with prototypical running back size who plays like a running back after the catch. I mean, this is a guy who's 6 foot, 230 pounds. And you mentioned he is an absolute menace in terms of the touchdown game. You mentioned Tyreek Hill as maybe being the only lock for 12-plus touchdowns. I could probably comfortably project A.J. Brown, if he plays 16 games every year over maybe even the next 8 years, to score 10-plus touchdowns nearly every single year. That's how talented this guy is. That's how incredible he is at putting the ball in the end zone. And that just doesn't come specifically in the red zone. I mean, this is a guy who he could take a slant to the house from 60 yards out, no problem. Right. He is that type of receiver like Tyreek Hill on any given play of any given game can immediately turn your fantasy football matchup on its head. And we're talking about this type of potential at 23 years old, now tethered to a really good quarterback with the way Ryan Tannehill has been playing. I am all in on A.J. Brown. And yeah, given the question mark surrounding Davante Adams' situation, I can comfortably project A.J. Brown to take over that number 2 spot.
Right. And I think with Tannehill and A.J. Brown together, you get that Aaron Rodgers, Davante Adams-like connection where we just know where the ball is going on most plays, right? Like in the red zone, A.J. Brown's the guy. In, 3rd and 11, it's going to be A.J. Brown. Like, we haven't been able to say that for A.J. Brown to this point in his career. He's been a guy that we've had to rely on efficiency with. And as a guy that won a championship with A.J. Brown as my wide receiver 1 last year, I can tell you that this guy legitimately made 5 to 10 highlight reel plays over the course of the season. And if he's doing that, plus he's getting another 40 targets or whatever compared to what he did last year, then we're talking about a guy that has wide receiver 1 in fantasy type of upside, who's 23 years old right now?
Yep. Yeah, and definitely. If someone honestly, again, I love Tyreek Hill. If someone wanted to argue A.J. Brown as being their dynasty wide receiver 1, I would listen to that argument because, quite frankly, he is one of the only few dynamic talents, dynamic situations that can comfortably make an argument. So I fully agree. A.J. Brown's a bona fide stud. Let's get into the wide receiver 1 on points per game last year at our number 3 overall slot, and that's going to be Davante Adams. Let me preface this by saying he is wide receiver 3 for me specifically because of the question marks around Aaron Rodgers this offseason. Because let's be honest, when this guy is on the field, he is an absolute league winner, absolute game changer in your fantasy football matchups. I'm talking about a guy who he had 18 touchdowns in 13 and a half games played this year. 18. He led the league in touchdowns by 4 while missing 2.5 games. I mean, this guy is just an absolute freak. When he is on the field and when Aaron Rodgers is throwing him the football, you're talking about a guy with elite touchdown upside who's playing with Aaron Rodgers, one of the best quarterbacks I've ever seen in my life, who averaged 21 and a half PPR points per game this past season, which was 4th highest amongst non-quarterbacks despite missing those 2.5 games. I mean, it's just phenomenal. The talent is there. The question is really, how does he translate if Aaron Rodgers forces his way out? And this is simple for me. This is a superstar level wide receiver who I think at this point has really shown is independent from his quarterback play. No matter who's throwing him the football, he's going to score touchdowns. One of the best route runners in the league, one of the best after the catch guys in the league. And this elite talent shouldn't be tanked simply due to the question marks. I've seen this guy, again, you mentioned in the listener league, you got him in the 4th round of our startup, which is just absurd. He's only wide receiver 3 for me. He would be wide receiver 1 if we knew Aaron Rodgers was playing. But because of that uncertainty, he falls all the way down to 3, right? But with that being said, what are your thoughts on Adams?
Yeah, and Adams gives you like running back level wide receiver advantage, which makes no sense, right? Because we think of the Christian McCaffreys and the Derrick Henrys, the Saquon Barkleys. Those guys give you an advantage unlike any at the position, right? Because the difference between Christian McCaffrey and, back end wide running back 1 like Mark Ingram from 2 years ago is a monster difference, right? The difference between Davante Adams and Chris Godwin or someone like of that nature is a monster difference. It's that level of difference maker at the position. 18 touchdowns is running back touchdown type numbers, which is absurd for a wide receiver to be putting up. So yeah, I totally agree. Davante Adams would be my wide receiver 1 if we know Aaron Rodgers is, going to be the quarterback there now and going forward, because to be honest, he does need Aaron Rodgers to some extent. If Aaron Rodgers is traded, if Aaron Rodgers is gone from Green Bay, I might lower him even more. I don't know how much further he would drop, but he'd probably be around the range of a guy that I have with DeAndre Hopkins or something of that nature, because I think Davante Adams in the red zone especially will need a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers who's just absolute money in that kind of range of the field, because 18 touchdowns this year, if he didn't have Aaron Rodgers, we're probably looking at a 10 to 11 touchdown receiver, which is a lot of fantasy points that you'd be losing.
Yeah, and definitely I understand that. And just for kind of a reference to how dominant he was last year, so in terms of PPR scoring, the difference between Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill in points per game was the same difference between Derrick Henry and Myles Gaskin in PPR points per game. Yeah. That's how much of an advantage. That's how much of an advantage of Davante Adams was last year. Nearly 4.5 points per game difference in PPR formats. He's just such a difference maker. And you mentioned it though, because of Aaron Rodgers, got to lower him a bit. With that being said, who do we got at number 4? Another guy who broke out last year.
Right. And this is number 1 hit of my entire analysis last year, because I tweeted the day before the season started that Diggs would be a top 5 receiver. And what was he? Wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in fantasy. So this is a guy that I was touting, much like AJ Brown, honestly, the same type of argument you could make for AJ Brown this year. I was talking about with Stefon Diggs last year. The only difference was that he switched teams and he was going to a quarterback with some question marks. But last year, receivers that saw more targets than Stefon Diggs in 2019, D.D. Westbrook, Curtis Samuel, Danny Amendola, and Larry Fitzgerald. And this guy still finished as a wide receiver 2 in fantasy and had some absolutely monster weeks. When he went to Buffalo, he had nobody to compete for targets with. Like Cole Beasley's a fine receiver. John Brown was a fine receiver at the time, but he had no Adam Thielen on that team who he was competing with in Minnesota. And not only that, but Minnesota only passed the ball 466 times in 2019, and they targeted receivers at the 4th lowest rate in the entire NFL last year. So for me, it was pretty easy to see that if nothing else, Diggs is going to receive more than 94 targets in Buffalo. And that to me was worth a 6th round pick where he was going every single time. I'm like, yo, this dude's going to be on a lot of my teams because he deserves to go in the 3rd, 4th round. And he was going in the 6th round in most drafts because a lot of people were scared of the Josh Allen, narrative that he can't hit the broadside of a barn. But we saw once he had a guy like Stefon Diggs who can separate consistently, he was able to take major, major strides as far as an accuracy level quarterback, because he went from a guy in the 50% completion percentage range to a guy that was completing almost 70% of his passes. Yeah. Which was a huge jump. And He literally went out and led the NFL in targets. After I said, this guy's definitely going to get more targets in Buffalo, he literally led the NFL last year in targets, which was one of my best calls of the offseason. We have Diggs finally in an alpha role with a great quarterback who he's tied at the hip for the foreseeable future in Buffalo, because I'd imagine after this season, Josh Allen's going to get extended by the Bills, and Diggs will probably get extended at some point too. So 9 games with double-digit targets last year is absolutely absurd. Not a single game with less than 6 targets. He was the model of consistency this past year and should be, again, one of the more consistent options going forward. We have John Brown departing in free agency. He's going to be replaced by, Gabriel Davis. It's the Stefon Diggs show again. I expect him to get 10-plus targets in probably 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games again this year. And if he's giving you that kind of output, he's going to be top 5 in the NFL in targets. He's going to be a wide receiver 1 and probably a top 5, top 3 option again.
Yeah, I mean, he is an absolute stud. And, that change of scenery absolutely helped him. He went from a guy 94 targets in 2019, absurdly low for a guy of his talents, to, as you mentioned, leading the league in targets. I mean, that situation in Buffalo is as cream as you can get apart from Patrick Mahomes. So I fully agree. Stefon Diggs is a pure top 5 receiver for me in my dynasty rankings. And he's actually going to be tied for me with between our consensus with the guy I have at 4, and that's actually the guy who ended up replacing him in Minnesota. A guy that the majority of Dynasty Twitter is trying to say is wide receiver 1. While I understand if you want to make a youth argument, I just can't put him over those guys personally, but he's still cracking my top 5 at number 4 personally, number 5 consensus. That's going to be Justin Jefferson, who he actually replaced in Minnesota. This is the best rookie season we have seen since Odell Beckham Jr. in 2014. He had to find his way into this top 5 list. And I mean, coming in at number 5, you have to talk about Justin Jefferson. I mean, he smashed the rookie receiving record with a line of 88 receptions, 1,400 yards, and 7 touchdowns across 16 games. And this was really despite failing to earn a full-time role until week 3. And in those first 2 weeks, he combined for 6 total targets. Week 3 on, this guy averaged 18.73 PPR points per game, which across a full season would actually be the wide receiver 5 as a 21-year-old rookie. Yeah, you heard that correctly. I'm betting on a talented kid coming off the best rookie season in NFL history at the receiver position. And honestly, I think the sky's the limit for this guy. We could be talking about a guy who this upcoming year, he had 1,400 as a rookie. Would I be surprised if we were talking about a 1,600-yard 12 touchdown season this year? I wouldn't be shocked. The question mark that I really have with him that we really saw with Davante Adams, as I mentioned too, is the ambiguity, the question marks around Kirk Cousins in the long-term future. I mean, the Vikings have already said that they would have taken Justin Fields if he fell to 14. They ended up selecting Kellen Mond in the 3rd round. We already had Justin Jefferson go on a show and basically say, oh yeah, Justin Fields would have added a different element to our offense. With these question marks kind of reigning, I still don't really care enough to drop Justin Jefferson further than this, because let's be honest here. Again, he is still that 21 years old. You heard that correctly. My age, year-old stud, absolutely dominating the NFL in his rookie season. No brainer, top 5 overall dynasty receiver. What are your thoughts on Jefferson?
I mean, the reason I have him at 5 and not ahead of Diggs or Adams or Hill or any of those guys, because I know there's definitely going to be analysts out there that have him ahead of some of those proven guys, is like I said, 3 to 4 year window. Would I rather have Tyreek Hill? Would I rather have Davante Adams? Would I rather have Stefon Diggs? I absolutely would. And I'm not comfortable projecting Justin Jefferson 6 years from now. Nobody should be. Nobody's that good of an analyst that they can project what's going to be happening in the NFL at that point. And like you mentioned, Kirk Cousins is playing his last season in Minnesota. I firmly believe this is happening right now. Yeah. Whether it's, he plays the whole season and then gets replaced by Kellen Mond, whether he plays the whole season, the Vikings draft the quarterback next year, I think this is Kirk Cousins' last season in Minnesota. And Justin Jefferson is going to be in a situation where he has a new quarterback coming in. He's a very talented receiver. I don't expect him to struggle playing with a new quarterback, but Kirk Cousins is a solid QB. And if the quarterback that comes in, if it's Kellen Mond, if it's some other guy, we could be talking about a quarterback that is less accurate than Kirk Cousins. And statistically speaking, that's very likely to be the case because Kirk Cousins has been one of the maybe top 12, top 10 most accurate QBs in the league over the course of the last few seasons. So it's a concern for me, and it's the reason I'm probably not going to own Justin Jefferson anywhere because he's going ahead of a lot of these guys and to a point where I'm not willing to pick him there. I would be comfortable getting him in the 3rd round of a dynasty startup, but I see him going early 2nd, late 1st sometimes even, and I'm just not comfortable picking a guy at that point because we basically have to see this guy reach Odell Beckham level heights of production the first couple seasons that Odell Beckham was in New York.
Yeah, no, I definitely see where you're coming from. There is more question marks than people want to acknowledge with Jefferson. Anyways, with that being said, who is your number 5 or number 6? Sorry.
Yeah, and this is a close argument between him and Jefferson. Obviously, if you're on a win now type of trajectory, let's say you're in the 3rd round, you picked, Christian McCaffrey and Ezekiel Elliott, your first 2 picks, like you're probably going to lean more towards this guy than you would towards Jefferson in the 3rd round. And I mean, there's probably no chance Jefferson's there in the 3rd round at this point, but DeAndre Hopkins, you can pretty much copy and paste every argument that I made for Stefon Diggs onto DeAndre Hopkins. He didn't miss a single step coming from the Houston Texans and an elite quarterback in Deshaun Watson to what I would consider a good to great quarterback in Kyler Murray. Diggs led the league in targets, but DeAndre Hopkins finished 2nd. He was 160 targets this past year. The reason I have Diggs at least ahead of DeAndre Hopkins is due to the quarterback play and due to the certainty that I have with Josh Allen continuing to keep up his level of play that we saw last year versus what is more of a projection in Kyler Murray, because Hopkins last year dealt with a target quality rating, which ranked 63rd in the NFL from Kyler Murray versus where Diggs ranked at number 20. And both of those guys were more used as downfield type options. So compared to all NFL receivers, they should be ranking not inside the top 10 because they're getting deeper, A-dots than a guy like Cole Beasley, for example. But nonetheless, I think Diggs' quarterback play is significantly better than Hopkins' quarterback play, and Diggs is a bit younger than Hopkins, which is why I have him ahead. 6 touchdowns only from DeAndre Hopkins in 2020, despite seeing 160 targets. If you're seeing 160 targets, I expect you to get 10 touchdowns. And Diggs only had 8 touchdowns last year, so I'm not holding it against Hopkins too much, but Kyler's going to hold Hopkins back a little bit. We saw games last year, especially towards the end of the season, where Hopkins had 12 targets and he'd only catch 5 balls. Like, that's a pretty big deal. If you're getting 12 targets, you should catch 8 of those, I would say, for most receivers. So DeAndre Hopkins still should be locked into a top 6 receiver, at least for the next 2-3 seasons. But as much as I love some of these young guys, I can't put DK Metcalf ahead of DeAndre Hopkins because I can't reasonably say that I would rather have DK Metcalf for the next 2 to 3 years over Hopkins, because I know Hopkins is giving me a top 5 ceiling, number 1 overall ceiling, if he can get into the double-digit touchdown range.
Yeah, and I'll talk about Metcalf next, but I think we're kind of a little bit different in terms of how we view it. You're more so drafting for the win now type ideology. I'm more so focused on more of the appreciating asset level of fantasy football, which they're both different styles, different strategies that you can use when attacking your drafts. But anyway, so with that being said, we're going to talk about DK Metcalf, and the reason why he ranks higher for me is simply due to the fact that you're talking about a guy who is a similar finish to Hopkins last year, except he did it at 23 versus 28. When you're actually talking about the 2020 season of DK, however, I can understand the risk involved with looking at that Seattle offense, because in the first 8 games of the season, we're talking about a guy who averaged 21.23 PPR points per game on nearly 5 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown per game. And that number completely went down in the last 8 games of the season. We're talking about a guy from 21.23 PPR points per game to 12.94, from 98.5 yards per game to 64.38, from a touchdown per game to a touchdown every 4 games. It's insane when you really look at it. On one hand, that first 8 game stretch, he was on a wide receiver 3 PPR pace, only trailing Tyreek Hill and what Davante Adams put up. However, that 12.94 pace would have ranked him wide receiver 34 in points per game amongst wide receivers who play 10 plus. And people might say, oh, well, I can't take a guy with that much variance. While I understand that the second half splits are concerning, let's keep in context what the competition was in those 8 games, because 6 of his final 8 games actually came against teams that ranked top 10 amongst defenses versus opposing wide receivers in fantasy points per game, including the Rams 2 times, who were the best team at limiting wide receivers, the Washington football team, who was 2nd, the Bills, who were 5th, the Cardinals, who were 10th, and the Giants, who were 8th. And the 2 outliers in that stretch were the New York Jets, who were 17th, in a game where Seattle really went up early and ran the ball down the Jets' throats the rest of the game. Russ only had 27 passing attempts, whereas the Seahawks team had 36 rushing attempts in that game. And the other was Philadelphia, 25th versus opposing receivers, where DK, in prime time, torched them for 10 for 177. I understand that it's concerning because yearly he's going to play the Rams. Yearly he's going to play the Cardinals, who were good against opposing wide receivers.
And the Niners.
And the Niners when they're healthy this year. But DK should see some better luck in terms of positive matchups on his schedule for the next year. And for a guy who's a certified stud at 23 years old, who for now is still tethered to a star quarterback with Russell Wilson, I can't rank him any lower than 7. But the question mark surrounding the consistency game to game of that Seattle offense, also with the uncertainty of Russ's potential departure, is really why he's not even higher on this list for me personally.
Right. And people talk about consistency with wide receivers all the time, right? The narrative around wide receivers is that they're more consistent than running backs, right? Especially when you get into like the 3rd, 4th round range of a redraft league or of a dynasty league. But the problem with guys like DK Metcalf is I agree with this ranking. I think he should be wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7, and he's not a consistent guy. So to me, it's a lot like the running back position. Once you get outside the top 4 or 5 guys or so, everyone's a little bit inconsistent. And DeAndre Hopkins for me is one of those top 4 or 5 guys that is consistent on a weekly basis, which is why I would take him over a guy like DK Metcalf. And I think he helps your dynasty roster and your redraft roster more because of the consistency that he brings to the table. DK Metcalf had a number of games last year where he went 2 for 28, 3 for 46, 2 for 23, right? And yeah, some of those were bad matchups, but at the same time, he's going to have bad matchups all the time because he plays in a division with Jalen Ramsey. He plays in a division with the San Francisco 49ers. He's going to play, 2 or 3 teams a year where he's going up against a top tier cornerback. And DK Metcalf is good enough to beat some of those guys more often than not. But at the same time, we have a team that is not a pass-heavy team. We have a team that is committed to the run no matter what. And from a future perspective, we have a quarterback who's disgruntled and might want out of that situation. So he's a guy that I just can't rank higher than this. I know some people are going to have him wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 in Dynasty. To me, that's strictly on age. I don't think there's a chance that those guys would go ahead of any of the people that we talked about, Diggs, Hopkins, Hill, or Adams, if we're talking about a guy that, if we're trying to project a 2 to 3 year window. And that's what I like to do with wide receivers. It's like, to me, it's too hard to project 7 years ahead. So I will just stick with the 2 to 3 year window kind of theory. And to me, there's no way I can pick him over Hopkins or Adams.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. Like when you're talking about who you would want on your team, I understand it. For me, again, I mentioned the appreciating asset thing. I just kind of view it like if you pick the 23-year-old, you could probably end up getting the older player plus in a trade. So I don't know. I'm a big trade degenerate as it is, as we well know. If you guys are in the listener league, I basically offer everyone on a daily. But that being said, we can talk about a teammate of a depreciating asset in fantasy over these last few years. Take it away with Calvin Ridley.
Yeah, and Calvin Ridley, comparatively to the rest of this list, is the guy that's in the middle, right? Because he's not the youngest guy on this list. He's probably he's 25, 26 years old right now. But he's not, at the age of a guy like Tyreek Hill is 27, DeAndre Hopkins is like 29, Davante Adams probably like 28. So he's about in the middle between some of these young guys and some of these older guys. We don't expect Julio Jones to be gone this year, at least from Atlanta. He should be back and hopefully healthy, but the splits for Calvin Ridley are fine regardless. You'll see them on the screen right now. He averaged nearly 18 PPR points per game with Julio Jones in the lineup, and when Julio Jones was out, he was up near 21 PPR points per game. So if Julio's back this year, you can expect Calvin Ridley to be a back-end wide receiver 1, maybe even a top 8 wide receiver like he was last year. But I expect this to be Julio's last year. If he's there this year, I don't think he's going to be back after this. Ridley performed despite Atlanta scoring 16th most points in the NFL last year. And if everyone's back and healthy this year, including Julio, and if Kyle Pitts is able to step in and be, an upgrade over Hayden Hurst and Matt Ryan is playing back to the form that we've seen Matt Ryan play the past couple of years, their offensive line can improve a little bit. We should expect this to be a top 12 scoring offense. And since these are dynasty rankings, Julio will absolutely be gone after this year. I don't think there's any way in hell that Julio is back after this season. And at that point, Calvin Ridley is closer to that 20.56 PPR points per game average without Julio Jones. And it should just be him and the Kyle Pitts show after this year and beyond. And at that point, you're getting a guy who's going to be 27 years old, entering the prime of his career. And for that 3 to 4 year window, from the point he's 23 years old, he's going to be a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy and a guy that is probably, like you mentioned, going to appreciate in value once Julio Jones has actually been traded or been cut or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I absolutely love Calvin Ridley. And he kind of is in that tier where he's like teetering on the tier 2-3 for me. Like he's, I think, above like the MT Godwin tier that we're going to mention next, but he's kind of a little bit behind what I expect with the Jefferson, Diggs, Metcalf. And that's simply due to the fact that he's not the youngest guy, but he's also like not the most win now type of guy in terms of comparatively to a guy like Diggs, to a guy like Hopkins. So with that being said,
he's great for a 1-year rebuild too. Like for example, if you have in your team in our listener dynasty league, you're a 1-year rebuild, right? You have a rookie quarterback who we expect to be really good by next year. You have Deshaun Watson, who we expect to be really good by next year. Calvin Ridley is exactly the type of guy that he's going to be good this year. He's not going to be bad this year. He'll probably be a top 12 receiver in redraft, but next year we're talking about a guy that could be a top 3, top 5 receiver. He could have that, the argument we're making for AJ Brown, we could be making that argument a year from now from Calvin Ridley. And again, we're talking about a guy that had 1,300 yards, 1,374 and 9 touchdowns last year with Julio Jones on the field for about half the season. So even if he can go 1,374 and 9 touchdowns again this year, he's going to be a top 5 receiver this year. And then again, we have that projectability going forward that he's going to potentially get into that 1,500 yard, 12 touchdown range.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Calvin Ridley is a stud, and the fact that he is even at 8 just goes to show how top heavy and how deep this position is. It's phenomenal. But with that being said, we can go on to our number 9, and a guy that for most people last year was going to be ranking number 1 on their list, and that's going to be Michael Thomas, wide receiver from the Saints. Let's just kind of break down the common narrative that people want to put on MT. People want to say, oh, MT without Breeze, he should see a huge downtick in production. That narrative just simply does not hold true. Well, Corey should be putting this on the screen about right now, but his 2020 without Breeze versus his 2019 record-breaking season with Breeze, yes, the numbers went down a bit. I'm not going to lie about that. About 12 targets per game and 9 receptions per game to about 9 targets and 7.5 receptions per game. But we're talking about a guy who set literal records in 2019. Even if Breeze was on the field, we should have expected a slight downtick in production because simply put, a 149 reception, 185 target pace was simply unsustainable for any type of receiver. However, we're talking about a guy in the 4 games that he played without Breeze this year with Taysom Hill in that offense, averaged 16.1 PPR points per game, 7.5 catches, over 9 targets, and nearly 86 receiving yards per game. The main detractor that was affecting his PPR point per game outage was the fact that he had 0 touchdowns in that 4-game stretch. Even if you took his 0.55 touchdown per game pace from 2019 and add it to his PPR points per game total from last year, that would equal 19.4 PPR points per game, which would have ranked him as the wide receiver 4 in 2020. So this is a guy that people want to outline as, oh, he's in decline. Oh, what are we going to do with Taysom Hill? And that simply does not hold true. Now, the main detractor that people are going to have on him is, well, if Taysom Hill starts, what should we expect? Well, Taysom Hill had 27 red zone rushing attempts and 6 red zone rushing touchdowns. That would obviously affect the touchdown output of a guy like Michael Thomas. However, Jameis Winston is going to be the presumed starter here. And Jameis Winston has shown throughout his career that he is absolutely able to carry or to support a top-end wide receiver in fantasy football. We saw it over the years with Mike Evans with your Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 1,000 yards in every single receiving season since he came into the league. And we're talking about a guy in 2019, Chris Godwin, who operated that big slot role for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, similar to what MT should offer with the Saints. We're talking about a guy in Chris Godwin who had 114 slot targets in 2019, whereas Michael Thomas had 180 in 2019. So we definitely seen that Jameis Winston has a history of being able to feed his big slot in the offense and give him requisite volume to be able to produce. MT is still that stud receiver that we were talking about as the wide receiver 1 last year. Don't let an offseason completely take him out of your top 12. I've seen people on Twitter talk about him being outside their top 12 wide receivers in Dynasty because he's older, because he's coming off a down year, injured year. Do not buy that hype. If you can get this guy, I've seen him go in Dynasty drafts 4th, 5th round. Take him there every single time because we're still talking about a guy in PPR especially who is going to average nearly 10 targets per game, who's going to average nearly 8 catches per game. Again, I mentioned 120 receptions, 148 target pace just last year with Taysom Hill. Don't buy the dip. Go take this guy.
Right. I totally agree with you. I'm actually looking right now where he went in our listener startup draft because I actually
went 5th round. I believe he went 5th round.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, you're right. He went in the 5th round. He went in the 5-5. So we're talking about an area of the draft. So I started the draft in the 3rd and 4th round. I got AJ Brown and Davante Adams. I was 1 pick away from getting Michael Thomas as my 3rd receiver in a dynasty startup after starting with Barkley and J.K. Dobbins as my running back. So if you're in a position where you can get Michael Thomas anywhere, honestly, outside the 3rd round, I would consider good value because this is a guy that, yeah, he had a down season last year, but if we're projecting anything close to what he did in 2019, which I don't think is reasonable to project for him. He had 185 targets in 2019, but I think you can project 160 targets for him going forward, because the type of role that he offers, the type of player that he is a player that is a heavy volume type of option. Touchdowns aren't going to affect his output very often, because he was never a guy, even in that 149 reception season. What he scored, 8 touchdowns or 9 touchdowns? Like,
he had 9 touchdowns, 0.55 TDs per game in that season, which just kind of goes to show you, or in that split with Breeze, which just kind of goes to show you that he is that a real option at the receiver position that's kind of independent from touchdowns. We mentioned it a little bit with DeAndre Hopkins as well. Michael Thomas is another. And if you can tell me that this guy would finish as a top 10 wide receiver on only 5 touchdowns last year, I would fully believe you. You can't say that much about any real other receiving options in this range.
Right. And I think Thomas is a guy that's he's bound to regress positively in terms of consistency and his ability to get open, catch the ball. Like, that's really all he offers to the table. He's a PPR monster. Whether Taysom Hill's the starter or not, they know that Sean Payton's offense. He's still going to know that Michael Thomas is his guy, the guy that he needs to feed the ball to. And like we said, we expect Jameis Winston to win this job because he's the better quarterback, and they can still use Taysom Hill if Jameis Winston's the starter. So regardless, I think Michael Thomas is really being picked at his floor right now, because at the point where you're getting him, you're getting him as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He's the 13th receiver off the board in our dynasty startup. And I don't see a way in a PPR format where this guy finishes anywhere outside the top 8 receivers for this year, for the year after. And yeah, we have a bit of a murky quarterback situation, but whatever quarterback they bring in, whether it's Jameis Winston for the next couple of years, Taysom Hill for the next couple of years, or they draft somebody next year, something like that, we know that Michael Thomas is going to get top 5 volume at the position every year.
Yep. No, I fully agree. And quite simply, this is a guy who, for a win now team, if you can get him at 508, 505, whatever type startup value, and to be honest, you might be able to get MT for like 9th rounders, like Jerry Jeudy and like a 2nd round pick, someone might honestly.
Right. And if you could still trade, if you haven't had your rookie draft yet, you could probably trade a mid first round pick for Michael Thomas. Like, someone will probably give you Michael Thomas for like the 106, 105. And at that point, as much as I love Jamar Chase, like we want Jamar Chase to turn into 90% of what Michael Thomas has been for the last couple of years. And what Michael Thomas can offer you from a volume perspective is something that I don't think anybody can reasonably project for Jamar Chase.
Yeah, 100%. And to be honest, you mentioned 105, 106. You could probably swing a deal for like the 108. Because that's how rookie fever is going to take an effect. People are going to want to get these rookie picks. You can probably get the 108 or get MT for the 108. So I fully agree. As a win now type of asset, MT really can't be beat in this type of range.
Right. And as much as I hate Michael Thomas, there's no way I would have passed him as my wide receiver 3 in that startup that we're in. Yeah. So the next guy that we're going to be talking about is kind of similar to Michael Thomas in terms of a recency bias type of player. Chris Godwin. If Michael Thomas was the wide receiver 1 in dynasty startups last year, Chris Godwin was probably the wide receiver 2, to be honest. A very unfortunate and nagging injury-riddled season for Godwin is going to really turn a lot of people from Chris Godwin's dynasty value away from him. They're just going to be like, this guy was injury-riddled last year. He's got a lot of target competition in his offense. He's got Mike Evans, he's got Antonio Brown, Rob Gronkowski's still there. We got some young receivers that people are excited about, but this is a guy that was a top 3 dynasty wide receiver amongst the industry last year. If you exclude the Green Bay game from his output last year where he left early, we're talking about a guy that played 11 completely banged up games last year. And despite the hand injury, the lower body stuff that he was dealing with, he had 112 target pace, 87 receptions, 1,152 yards, and 10 touchdowns, which would have been the wide receiver 9 in PPR, wide receiver 8 in half PPR last year. This is a top 5, maybe top 3 scoring offense for at least the next 2 years guaranteed with Tom Brady in the fold. And Godwin, when he was on the field, made that offense a lot better. They went from 32 points per game, and some of their worst games played of the season against the Bears, against the Rams, against the Giants, those were games that Godwin didn't play. So you could really, you could feel the absence of Godwin in those games. He was the high volume target guy over the middle, the guy that would be great in PPR, the guy that, moved the chains on 3rd down. And Godwin was also able, after he came back from his injuries in week 9 and he was, for the most part, fully healthy, Antonio Brown was on the team at that point, and he was still a guy that was producing. He was a guy that was, again, on pace for more of like an 1,100-yard, 10-touchdown type of pace if you pace those numbers out. And Godwin is just a complete recency bias victim. People who had him last year in redraft leagues probably want nothing to do with him in Dynasty. But let's not forget, this is a guy that's 25 years old, had a 1,400-yard season 2 years ago, and is attached to the right arm of a 40-touchdown quarterback last year in an offense that might even be better than it was last year because they have the continuity of Bruce Arians' system where if you look at quarterbacks, Carson Palmer, Jameis Winston, whoever the case is, Andrew Luck, Ben Roethlisberger, their first year in the Bruce Arians system was a down season. And Brady threw 40 touchdowns his first year in Bruce Arians' system. And in that second year, if he's going into the second year and he improves upon that, we're talking about a guy that could win MVP next year. And if Godwin is even his number 2 receiver, which I expect him to be, but he's probably going to be the number 1 target on that team in terms of target volume, we're talking about a guy that can finish as a top 3 receiver still.
Yeah, no, definitely. He's got that upside. Let's keep in mind that he was the wide receiver 2 on both standard and PPR in 2019 on only 121 targets. Yeah, you guys heard that correctly. An extremely efficient receiver. Now adds Tom Brady to the fold. We saw it a little bit last year. He's still that talented stud, only 25 years old. I fully agree. I mean, Chris Godwin's a bona fide stud, and if you can get him at value, he's absolutely worth that pick. He probably also went in the 5th round of a rookie startup. I can't really see it right now because I don't got the screen open.
I bet he went later than that. I'm looking right now.
Yeah.
He went 5'9". So he went, he was the 15th receiver off the board. Brandon Ayuk and Devontae Smith were the receivers that immediately followed him. And as much as I like those guys, they're not producing anywhere close to the amount that Godwin's going to produce at least this year on the franchise tag. And I'm telling you this as a Bucs fan, he ain't going anywhere. Like he's not going to get to free agency after this season. They're going to re-sign the guy. We have the best guy in the NFL, and he's going to be a Tampa Bay Buccaneer for the foreseeable future. And if that happens, you got him tethered to the right arm of Tom Brady for at least the next 2 years, potentially even longer with the psychotic nature of Tom Brady. So, like I say, 2 to 3 year windows. Just look at Dynasty in 2 to 3 year windows. Don't worry about what's going to happen with Godwin 4 years from now because it's really too hard to project at that point. And even if, let's say he does hit free agency after this year, let's say like you could probably sell him after this season for a lot more than you can get him for right now because I expect him to have 1, a better season this year than he did last year, and 2, people will buy into the unknown going into his free agency. If he does hit free agency, they'll be like, oh, but what if he goes to like the Colts or like whatever team they want him to go to? And you could probably sell him for very, very high-end value at that point if you don't believe in him, going forward. So at the very least, this is, like Danny said, this is going to be an appreciating asset because I think the value that he's at right now is only going to go up from here.
Yep, I fully agree. Again, I was actually going to take that word right out of your mouth. I think Chris Godwin is that ideal appreciating asset that nobody's really talking about or giving the credit to. So I fully agree. Chris Godwin, number 10 on our list. Let's talk about the wide receiver 11 on our consensus rankings. That's going to be a win now type receiver, but one of the best win now receivers you could possibly get. And that's going to be Keenan Allen from the Los Angeles Chargers. I mean, we're talking about a guy in Keenan Allen. Once Justin Herbert took over the starting job, had 1 game with less than 10 targets. You heard that correctly. 1 game with less than 10 targets. I mean, we're excluding games where he left early against the Raiders and the Saints. That just goes to show you that a 16-game pace of 160 targets, you can only really talk about Michael Thomas.
The only 2 that did it last year.
Yeah, Michael Thomas, Diggs, and Hopkins are probably the only 3, if you were talking about going into the season, would be on that pace. That just goes to show you he's an elite volume option tethered to the right arm of one of the best up-and-coming quarterbacks in the league with Justin Herbert. If he's able to stay healthy, that offense is only going to improve. We talked about in the early redraft rankings, if they add a tackle. Well, they just had, the consensus offensive tackle number 2 in the class, Rashawn Slater, fall to them at 13. The defense gets scarier. They could create more takeaways. This is a team that I fully expect to be one of the best teams in the entire AFC this year. And you always want to surround yourself with talents on one of the top teams because, quite frankly, they're going to be putting up points. That Chargers offense is going to be in that fringe top 5 to 7 overall in the entire league. And in general, if you're talking about a win now asset, you can't go wrong. This is a guy who I will bet the farm on finishing as a top 5 to 8 minimum wide receiver in 2021. The reason why he ranks a little lower on my personal rankings is simply due to that age 29. It's simply due to that age 29. I know people might say, well, why are you just looking at the age? I'm not looking at the age more so than what the Dynasty community, everybody in general, is going to evaluate that age as. Because, again, we mentioned appreciating assets. Even with a great season, as crazy as this sounds, there's going to be people out there that say, oh, well, he's 30 years old. He might be coming off a 110 reception, 1,500-yard, 9-touchdown season, but he's 30 years old. I want no part with him. It just goes to show you how cold cut the Dynasty community is in general, that the fact that This guy who has a legitimate wide receiver 1 overall upside, in my opinion, I think you can agree with that with Justin Herbert in town, is going to be undervalued going throughout the offseason. This is going to be a guy who you can get in the 6th, 7th round of your startups nearly every year as people keep talking about the age, talking about the age. Take him at value. We have him at 11 here. You could probably get him as the wide receiver 17, 18 off the board in your drafts.
Right, and he's the perfect too. If a team in your league has him on their team, send him a first-round pick, like a late first-round pick. I bet you can get this guy for a late first-round pick because people are going to look, oh, he's 29 years old, but they're going to fail to remember that his 29 is different from, let's say, Tyreek Hill's 29 because Keenan Allen ran a 4.76 coming out of school. He is not a fast receiver. We don't have to worry about this guy slowing down because he was never fast to begin with. We got a guy that is a route runner. He's a technician, and these guys tend to play longer in the NFL. They tend to play. I mean, we see Emmanuel Sanders, 35 years old at this point. Like he's still a guy that's been able to produce over the past couple of years. We see Antonio Brown, who's 32 years old, still looking. I mean, to me, he didn't produce the same, but he's in a very crowded situation. He still looked like the same receiver to me that we saw with the Steelers, back in 2017, 2018. Keenan Allen, to me, in a 3-year window, is going to produce probably better than maybe 3 or 4 other receivers over that span. And I have him at wide receiver 11. Honestly, I feel a little bit too low on him. I think I should raise him up because I believe that much in this dude. And the Chargers were the 19th scoring offense last year. They ranked 19th in the NFL. And even if let's say Justin Herbert isn't going to take the step that we anticipate, let's say there's no way they're finishing below 19. Even if he takes a little bit of a step back, they're still going to be a top 15 scoring offense with the fact that Austin Eckler should be healthy this year, with the fact that Keenan Allen should be healthy, the fact that their offensive line got better. They added, Mike Williams maybe can stay healthy somehow. Josh Palmer, they added in the draft. I expect this to be a top 15 scoring offense at minimum. Keenan Allen is a guy that legitimately has 15 touchdown upside next year.
Yeah, no, I fully see it. This is an absolute stud in one of the best offenses in the league, and you mentioned the volume. With that being said, we can go into the next guy and final guy rounding out our top 12 before we get into the honorable mentions. That's going to be the young receiver out of Carolina, talking about a little age, talking about appreciating asset. If DJ Moore has a breakout season this year, good luck trying to attain him in Dynasty.
Right, and this is a guy that is really, really tough to project, right? Because DJ Moore's 2020 was virtually a repeat of last year, right? Because last year, our arguments for him, both me and Danny were very high on this guy last year. It was mostly frustration with his quarterback play, right? In 2019, he dealt with Kyle Allen and, whoever else, Cam Newton for a bit. And he had very low touchdown output. I think he only had 3 touchdowns in 2019. Well, last year, he only had 4 touchdowns. And I know we said this last year, but this should be the last time that we have to deal with these inconsistencies with DJ Moore. So let's say, we got Curtis Samuel leaving Carolina. He vacates over 100 targets, 900 yards, and he was replaced by a rookie in Terrace Marshall, who probably won't see that kind of production as a rookie, but, 2 years from now, maybe he establishes himself. And by that point, Robbie Anderson might be gone as well. So Sam Darnold comes in as the quarterback. And my thinking with DJ Moore is that if he sees another bad quarterback play season, let's say Sam Darnold comes in and he looks like Jet Sam Darnold. He doesn't look like what we think he can be in Carolina with the, the better system around him with Joe Brady's offense. And DJ Moore has another 3 to 5 touchdown season. He goes for 1,100 yards like he always does, but those touchdowns are not where they need to be to make him go from, a wide receiver 18 type to a wide receiver 8 or a wide receiver 6 or something like that, where I think DJ Moore can be if he gets consistent quarterback play. We've already heard pretty much throughout this entire offseason that this is the leading candidate to go out and get Deshaun Watson. If Sam Darnold is not good this year, I expect Deshaun Watson in teal and black. And I think if Deshaun Watson's legal situation didn't arise, we're already talking about a situation where Deshaun Watson's a Carolina Panther. I think it already would have happened if we're talking about Deshaun Watson not having this whole legal situation, floating over his head. So whether it's Darnold able to perform, whether they add a big-time quarterback upgrade in 2022, I think maybe you take a bit of your lumps, and DJ Moore is only a top 15 wide receiver this year. We're still talking about a guy that is only going to go up in value. We're talking about a 24, 25 years old wide receiver who has a tremendous profile, has been super productive, just has been, hamstrung by bad quarterback play. We saw this from DeAndre Hopkins early in his career where he wasn't able to, get a decent quarterback worth a damn. And then once Deshaun Watson came in, we're talking about a guy that's finishing as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy, top 5 consistent wide receiver year in and year out. I have him at 12 because he's safe as fuck. But he has an untapped ceiling. People will assume he doesn't have that high of an upside, but he has an untapped ceiling once they can figure out the quarterback situation.
Yeah, we're talking about a guy who has 1,400-yard output type of potential. And if he sees any type of luck in that touchdown regression type game, especially with improved quarterback, and hopefully whether it's Sam Darnold, whether it's Deshaun Watson coming into town within a year, If he has anything like 7, 8 touchdowns with the extreme receiving output potential that he has, we could be talking about a guy on any year basis as a top 5 overall wide receiver at 24 years old. I fully love DJ Moore. And you mentioned you have him at 12. I have him at 13. He is an absolute stud and deserves wholeheartedly to be in this discussion, especially as a top 12 receiver. That being said, let's get into the honorable mentions on our list. And we actually have CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase actually tied for like the next rating according to our consensus on the list, and Amari Cooper rounding out the top 15. I actually had both CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase on my top 12, and that's simply due to the fact that we talk about appreciating assets. By the way, if you made it this far in the video, comment down below appreciating asset, because that's the theme of this video. None get more appreciative than what CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase represent. 21-year-old receivers going into their seasons. Like if Jamar Chase has an 1,100-yard, 7-8 touchdown rookie season, we could be talking about a guy getting valued similar to what Justin Jefferson is currently by the Dynasty community, similar to what CeeDee Lamb, 1,300-yard pace with Dak, one of the best offenses in the league, tethered to the right arm of a top 5 to 6 quarterback in the league. Fully agree with that. And talk about Amari Cooper, you can get into him a bit as well, but same thing I said with CeeDee Lamb. Dak Prescott's coming back. That offense is going to be dynamic.
Right. And if you look at Amari Cooper's, game logs before Dak went down, we're talking about a guy that probably would have won people leagues this year had Dak stayed healthy, because
200 target pace.
I was upset that I didn't draft Amari Cooper in one of my leagues. I took Robert Woods ahead of him, which was a huge mistake on my part. Luckily for me, Dak Prescott ended up getting injured, didn't burn me too bad. But I think to me, we have differing dynasty philosophies, right? Which is why I have a guy like so my 13 to 15 are Terry McLaurin, Mike Evans, and Amari Cooper. To me, those guys are all established. They're all going to take, especially Terry McLaurin, I expect him to take a huge step forward in his career, finally having a decent quarterback. Mike Evans, just pretty much the same arguments I said for Keenan Allen and Michael Thomas and Chris Godwin. 2 to 3 year window, Mike Evans is going to be a double-digit touchdown lock. He's going to be an 1,000-yard receiving lock. He's literally never had less than 1,000 yards in his entire 7-year career so far. And Amari Cooper, again, a little bit inconsistent, much like Mike Evans, but at the same time, he's been more consistent since he got to Dallas. And he's a guy that's going to be a lock for 1,300, 1,400 yards if Dak Prescott's able to stay healthy and the whole offense is able to stay healthy. And I also have Allen Robinson ahead of Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb, who I have at 17 and 18, just because as much as I love those young assets, right? I play to win now. That's how I play Dynasty. I play to win the championship that year. And if I were rebuilding, maybe it's a different story. If I were to try and, go into a Dynasty league, take some younger assets and try and get appreciative value and build my team going forward. But I always play to win, which is why I will take Terry McLaurin, Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, and Allen Robinson over those two young guns who will undoubtedly be overvalued by people a year from now. I just would rather, take the fantasy points rather than the value.
That's definitely fair again. And to be honest, aside from our differing philosophies for the most part, 13 of our top 15 receivers are completely identical in terms of having the same guys in. The only difference really being is you having Evans and McLaurin, myself having Lamb and Chase. With that being said, if you guys made it this far, again, I know, comment down below, but just keep in mind there's different ways to play Dynasty, which makes it so much fun, which makes it so much different from redraft. I mentioned with the running backs, but in redraft, you're looking at year one output. You're looking at who can give me the most fantasy points in that current year. In Dynasty, there's so many factors affecting it, which just honestly makes it such a more evolution or whatever, more dynamic type game, if you will. So with that being said, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Anything you want to close out with, Corey?
Do you want to talk about a couple of the guys that we have at our back end of our top 20 real quick?
Yeah, we can mention.
I have Brandon Ayuk and Courtland Sutton closing out my top 20 at 19 and 20. I really love Brandon Ayuk, man. I think he's the type of guy that is really, really going to appreciate and value, especially if I think Trey Lance, like we're both very high on Trey Lance. If Trey Lance comes out and looks anything like Justin Herbert did his rookie season, we're talking about Brandon Ayuk being a guy that's going to get valued similar to, the Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb level of young asset in Dynasty. And I think when you look at Brandon Ayuk, what he did last year, he was the model of consistency from a target perspective. And yeah, George Kittle and Deebo Samuel are coming back, but this is a guy that Kyle Shanahan said he was their number one ranked wide receiver, and they might have taken him at 13 ahead of CeeDee Lamb, ahead of Jerry Jeudy in that draft. And I believe him because he totally fits that system. He totally fits that scheme. He's a versatile piece, and he has the size, the athleticism, the ability to be a number one receiver in this league. And I think when you're tethered to that kind of offense and potentially that kind of quarterback, he's the type of guy that I'm willing to bet on, again, appreciating in value, much like you see with Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb. And then Courtland Sutton, again, another pretty much underrated receiver who, much like DJ Moore, might not be the most productive guy this year, probably like an 1,100-yard, 5-touchdown type season. But in 2022, we're talking about a guy that could have Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback, a guy that could have, Deshaun Watson potentially as his quarterback. He could have
Russell Wilson.
Yeah, like Russell Wilson or Spencer Rattler or some of these highly touted rookies. And again, if he gets a quarterback like that, if nothing else, his value is going to go up. Whether his fantasy points go up is the different story. But his value, if Aaron Rodgers is traded to the Denver Broncos before the NFL season starts, what can you get for Cortland Sutton, realistically, right? You could sell this guy for one type of value.
Yeah, you probably get 2 once.
Yeah, this is a guy that's been productive with bad quarterbacks already. So there's no even discounting the fact that he could just come out this year and be a 1,200-yard, 8-touchdown receiver with Drew Lock as his quarterback.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Cortland Sutton is an absolute stud. I think he's actually my 21, which goes to show you how kind of in sync we are. The 2 guys I have rounding out my top 20 are going to be T. Higgins. Mentioned it with Jamar Chase. But this is an offense that's only going to go on the rise. Talking about Joe Burrow, 41 passing attempts per game coming off of injury. They somewhat address the offensive line. I still think they're going to do that for the foreseeable future. And we're talking about a passing offense based off of volume, based off of presumed increased efficiency alone with the addition of Jamar Chase. We could be talking about a guy in T. Higgins, if he's coming off an 1,100-yard, 7-touchdown season this year, is only going to go up in value given the fact that he's still only, 22, 23 years old. So I fully agree. He's in this kind of tier 5 type range where you're getting into the wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3s. And I think T. Higgins is well deserving of a spot in my top 20. And Devonta Smith, we mentioned it at number 20. He's going to be that alpha dog. We talked about the rookie rankings. He's going to be that alpha dog for the Philadelphia Eagles. And he is the most pro-ready receiver, in my opinion, in this class. You mentioned Jamar Chase. He's got the situation edge. But in terms of stepping on the field, producing as a number 1 right away, I think Devonta Smith is that guy who's ready to step into that role.
Right. And another team that's been rumored to be in on Deshaun Watson is the Philadelphia Eagles. I saw a report today. I think it was the Panthers and Eagles are the 2 teams that are supposed to be in on him the most. So Watson's gone. Watson's not staying in Houston. Somebody's going to get this guy. And if I had to bet money on it, I would say it's one of the Panthers, Broncos, or Eagles. And we're just going to have to see how it plays out, right? But if any of these assets are undervalued, in my opinion, Cortland Sutton being an example of that, go out and acquire them just for that chance that either Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, or Deshaun Watson goes there. Because if we start hearing real rumors about this happening, even if it doesn't happen, you can sell them then, right? Because then people are still going to be willing to overpay for them. And that's kind of where me and Danny align is taking advantage of perception is a big, big deal in Dynasty because people will overvalue players just based on things that they're hearing on Twitter.
Narratives.
Narratives and other bigger fantasy analysts than us will peddle some shit like that, and it'll make everybody go out and acquire teams and players and people in certain situations. So make sure you guys are paying attention to that. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this rankings. Like I said, this rankings is not meant to be set in stone, right? Just because we have Michael Thomas at 9 and you have, Keenan, and we have Keenan Allen at 11. If you want to argue Keenan Allen over Michael Thomas, I don't disagree with you. If you want to argue, CeeDee Lamb over Michael Thomas because of that age discrepancy, because of the type of things that you're looking for in a rebuild, I don't agree with you. This is not meant to be a cut and dry list. I know some people like Cursory will look over it in the timestamps and see the Cursory list, go down to the comments and be like, how could you idiots have DeAndre Hopkins behind Justin Jefferson? But you know what? That's just the way she goes sometimes. If you guys made it to this point in the video, you guys are the real MVPs. If you watch the whole thing, you know our entire philosophy basically on wide receivers now. So like, comment, subscribe. If you are new to the channel, hit the bell icon. Join the Discord. That thing's growing every single day. Stay tuned for what we got coming up. We're going to start getting into redraft content and more of the season-long type of things coming up. We got a big announcement coming in the next few days. And me and Danny spent all of yesterday pretty much planning out our entire content schedule for the rest of the summer.
August.
We're super excited. We're ready to get into Dynasty season. We know that, redraft season. We know that fantasy football is coming back. Everybody's excited because there's mini camps and stuff going on. We couldn't be more excited to have an actual off season this year to talk about with you guys.
Yeah, definitely excited. That being said, peace out.